Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. If you could bear with us just 5 minutes, the moderator will be with us very shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, I think now we'll. Can you hear me? Good. I think we are ready to go now. Thank you very much. And firstly, I must apologize for the delay in starting the session due to conflicting commitments happening within the building. So I do apologize for that. But I'm very, very grateful that you're all here, and a very warm welcome to our session, which is very much in line with the ongoing discussions around the public forum theme of forging trade for a sustainable future. Our theme, as you have seen, is one that speaks to driving Africa's green transition. And in particular, we are focusing on the AfCFTA as a catalyst for environmentally friendly production, trade, and consumption. The African Continental Free Trade Area presents a unique opening for advancing environmentally friendly and socially inclusive production, trade, and consumption in Africa. The agreement, as many of you would already be aware, is one that is expected to unlock the expanded intra-African trade that can promote inclusive and sustainable development. And I wanted to underline that fact. At the same time, Africa is also faced with significant environmental challenges, including climate change. We recently had the African heads of state meeting in Nairobi over the climate summit, and many other meetings that have gone ahead of that. It's the climate change, it's the biodiversity loss, the pollution, food and water insecurity, as well as deforestation, which pose a huge risk to realizing the potential gains that could be ones that come through the effective implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Climate change, climate effects can reduce agricultural production, as we all know, and indeed, alongside that, the yields, as it can damage physical infrastructure and disrupt supply chains. And Africa's tourism industry relies heavily on the continent's biodiversity and natural attractions. We have taken a look at the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, as others have done. And I think what is coming up from our side is that we feel this agreement is not sufficiently ambitious in promoting trade that is environmentally sustainable. And as we engage with the panel, we'll hear a little bit more about that in terms of those that have gone deeper into looking at the provisions within the Continental Free Trade Agreement and how this relates to the level of ambition that is expected of everybody in terms of trying to move forward the implementation, but indeed ensuring that the provisions are adequate enough to advance an ambitious objective. So on our part, this session will discuss how the AfCFTA can drive environmental sustainability trade through answering the following: what the linkages are between the AfCFTA and environment. Secondly, how can market access provisions strengthen these links? Third, what steps can mainstream environmental considerations in the AfCFTA standards harmonization and intellectual property agendas? And finally, how can the AfCFTA promote sustainable consumption and uptake of green production methods by small, medium enterprises? I have with me an excellent panel who are bringing with them a lot of experience from different perspectives. And I do hope that through the engagement that we have this afternoon, we will be able to at least come to some conclusions that will not only help us in better understanding what the issues are, but more importantly, what it is that we can try to do going forward in terms of ensuring that we are supporting countries that are so much in need. But before I get to introducing my panel, I wanted to, put forward a few key messages that are coming from our side. And these are basically three key messages. One is on delivering on the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the AU Agenda 2063. And to me, this is really not an option. It's a must-have for Africa. It's a must-have for the world as well. And a big part of it is ensuring that we do this in a way that ensures that there is sustainability and resilience of the value chains, which is going to be a central part of ensuring the attainment of such an ambitious aspiration. And I wanted to just highlight within there that the role of micro, small, and medium enterprises remains crucial to the attainment of this objective. Connecting MISMEs, as we often refer to them, or connecting MISMEs to value chains is at the heart of all that we are trying to do. And this is also at the heart of ITC's work. But of late, we are also aware that sustainability and resilience of value chains has assumed greater importance due to the disruptions induced mainly by the pandemic and the demand for more sustainable production and trade. Linked to that is also the fact that the global supply chains increasingly require businesses to respond to consumer preferences for climate-friendly and sustainable production processes. Many of you are aware of what is happening with the European Union with respect to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, as most of you know it, which has important implications for the competitiveness for enterprises wishing to export to the EU. Finally, I just wanted to highlight with respect to the key message one is the fact that we as an organization are moving along, not only putting a lot of emphasis or prioritization on the efforts to adapt to environmental risks, but making sure that we are responding in a manner that is adjusting to the times. The second key message I wanted to share refers to the fact that the AfCFTA is an opportunity to advance sustainable production and trade in Africa, and MISMEs must be the driving force. Why is this so important? I think we all fully understand that the AfCFTA is one that is really intended to be a game changer for Africa, both in terms of providing the opportunity to accelerate and shift towards sustainable production and uptake of low carbon technologies, but as a whole, to shift and make sure that there's that transformative change happening at the continental level with collaboration across countries, with collaboration across different stakeholder groups to ensure that they make things happen. AfCFTA, national implementation strategies, programs, projects, and reforms can also be an aspect that really contributes to making sure that we achieve this particular aspect. I wanted to move on to key message 3, which is really speaking to ITC placing environmental sustainability at the heart of our interventions to promote MISME competitiveness. And here I just wanted to highlight a few specific actions that we have undertaken. One, of course, is ensuring that the green aspects are very much an integral part of our current ITC strategic plan 2022 to 2025, where we also have put an additional emphasis and elevation of the prioritization through what we refer to as moonshots. In short, these are just giving the additional boost because of the criticalness of this particular aspect, which goes, in describing further what we have articulated in our strategic plan. Second, we have since 2021 had the Green to Compete initiative, which enables MSMEs to enhance their competitiveness through green production. Third, our interventions promote resource efficiency and circularity in production and support increased MISME access to markets for green and biodiversity-based products. And here we have created a host of dedicated hubs to support small businesses. Fourth point is just to complement this work on the Green to Compete. We also have the ITC Trade for Sustainable Development Initiative, which supports MISMEs to understand and adhere to voluntary sustainability standards and to expand their market penetration. In Africa, of course, we have the One Trade Africa program, which is enabling African MISMEs to access CFTA business opportunities and a new green world. So perhaps enough to end by saying we are also very much involved in working in partnership with others. In particular, I wanted to highlight the work we are doing with the African Organization for Standardization to promote the use of standards and conformity assessments as tools for sustainable consumption and production. But this is just one part of it. We work with many other partners. And I wanted at this juncture to introduce my distinguished panelists. I will start with Colette van der Ven. Colette has been with us for a very long time, working with us in different situations and events. You have all seen perhaps the bios that have been circulated, so I'm not going to go into great detail because I'd like us to have a bit of time to actually exchange with each other. But suffice to say, she comes from a Geneva-based boutique consultancy advising public sector stakeholders on trade, environment, development nexus. She also serves as a visiting lecturer in a number of universities. So Colette, thanks for being here this afternoon. I move to the next person on my right. I do hope that I pronounced the name correctly. I struggled a little bit. Jayasura Kalaka, who is an expert consultant for the Economic and Trade Policy Unit of the United Nations Environmental Program, and they've been doing excellent work in this area. So thank you for being here this afternoon. And last but not least, for those that are present with me here, I go to Peter Nyeko, co-founder of Modulis Energy. He also serves as a CEO for that particular enterprise, which is a clean tech startup and social enterprise focused on developing and deploying new technologies, approaches to deliver energy that is affordable, reliable, sustainable, and capable of driving economic development. Thank you, Peter, for being here. I would also like to introduce somebody who's not here, but he will be joining us as he comes from another panel within the building. And this is His Excellency Ambassador Professor Mamadou Ka, who is the Ambassador of the Republic of the Gambia to the Swiss Federation, and is also the permanent representative to the UN office at Geneva, the WTO, and other international organizations here in Geneva. He has also served in various positions back home in the Gambia, and indeed here in Geneva, where he has been given leadership responsibilities with certain groupings that are present here at the WTO, within the African group, as well as within the human rights work that is currently ongoing. He will join us as soon as he's finished with the other session that he's on, but it is, I think, still okay for us to proceed and try to get the conversation going so that by the time he comes, we have enough time for us to start to allow him to say something, but to also start exchanging. I'm very much looking forward to the dialogue or the exchange with yourselves. So with that, and without further ado, let me proceed to Colette and start the ball rolling with you. In 2021, specifically in September, you produced an article which relates to, or which talks about greening the AfCFTA. And I think the key issue you were trying to address within that was one that was speaking to whether it was too late to do this within that context. I wanted to ask you, or perhaps to bring the conversation to have a better understanding around what you see as the linkages between the AfCFTA and the environment, and has something changed since you wrote this article, and whether the discussion around this particular issue has gained momentum at the continental level. So over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Dorothy. Can everyone hear me? Yes, this is on, great. So indeed, this is an article that you're referring to that was written during the pandemic in 2021. And one of the questions that we had, it was co-authored by Landry Signé, was, what are the linkages currently or at that time in the AfCFTA protocols and texts and agreements to the environment, and what are other ways in which potentially that could be strengthened? And what's interesting when you look at the AfCFTA, and at the time the 3 additional protocols, the text was not yet available, but so there it was the agreement on services and on trade in goods, and then the annexes to that. When you look at that, there is some environmental references made in the preambular language, and that's very generic references to the importance of essentially for state parties to regulate within their territories and provide flexibility for achieving legitimate policy objectives, including with regards to the environment. But as many of you know, a preambular language is not legally binding. It gives a direction, but that's essentially all it does. So there are those references. In addition, there are references, there are exceptions in the protocol on trade in goods and on trade in services, so that otherwise AfCFTA inconsistent measures, they could be justified if they comply with the language in the exceptions. And there, the exceptions clause set out in the AfCFTA is very similar to the exceptions clause set out in the WTO GET agreement. And there are 2 specific subparagraphs there that focus on exceptions if the measure has been adopted to advance human, plant, animal life, and also one relevant to the conservation of exhaustible resources. So those could be categories where otherwise inconsistent measures that have an environmental objective could potentially come in. However, as we also know from the context of the WTO, it's not clear exactly what that means, right? So there is some uncertainty about what that scope is. That is with regards to the jurisprudence here in this house. And in the context of the AfCFTA, we have yet to see any kind of adjudication, right? So there is an uncertain factor as to what exactly that exception means. So there, the conclusion that we had in that paper back in 2021 was that actually, when looking at the text of the agreement, the references to the environments are rather weak. And that was in a way a little surprising, because the AfCFTA has come in a time where a lot of new free trade agreements actually have either a separate chapter on the environment or on sustainability or specific provisions built within. So that went in a way a little bit against the trend as it was there. So that was then. Now, fast forward about 2 years, we have seen the text of the protocol on investment, the protocol of competition, the protocol also of IP, intellectual property. And what's really interesting is that there is indeed a little bit of, to answer your question, Dorothy, a trend, if you will, towards re-emphasizing the environment. You see this especially in the context of the investment protocol. There is numerous exceptions built in basically to, or if to otherwise discriminatory treatment of investors. So, you know, the investment protocol, it makes it easier for intra-African investors to come along along because you have protections, right? So there is less risk of losing certain types of, or business. But if there is a measure that's adopted for an environmental purpose that carves out an exception to otherwise a discriminatory treatment, whether most favored nation, which looks at treatment between different countries or investors in different countries, or national treatment, looking at discriminatory treatment between an investor at home and someone outside. And also exceptions are there covering expropriation. So you see a lot of those exceptions. Then with specific reference to the environment, you also interestingly see obligations on state parties to accept and respect minimum environmental measures. There's a reference also to some international agreements here. And also very interestingly, there's a focus on investor obligations. So you can benefit from the protection of this protocol and provided that as an investor, you comply with certain obligations that refer to, for example, protecting the environment. There's a reference to the precautionary principle, the obligation of carrying out risk assessment with an environmental emphasis, as well as a reference to causing no harm. So that really goes quite deep into integrating environmental principles into the coverage of the protocol on investment, which is really interesting to see. This is not entirely novel, however, because it builds very heavily on what was already there, which was the Pan-African Investment Protocol. And it also reflects some, if you will, environmental best practices that were already part of bilateral investment treaties between African countries and other members and other countries as well. And the regional economic communities have some of this language. So essentially what it has done is has built on those practices to then make that applicable at the African level. Then on the intellectual property side, the general or intellectual property protocol, general guiding principles also reference the environment and sustainable development. And there's also some references to developing marks or certifications that are important for or with regards to identifying environmentally sustainable products. So there is a reference there as well. And then finally, in competition, there is a reference generally to sustainable development. And interestingly, there's also a reference to the product or the provision where in basically assessing whether a merger is likely to restrict, distort, or otherwise distort competition, the authorities can assess potentially the potential to promote sustainable and inclusive development of that merger. So it's incorporated as a factor to consider whether a practice is anti-competitive. So that's also quite interesting. And just to wrap up, more generally, other than just the text there seems to be indeed an enhanced emphasis on the environment where UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, and I see Guillaume sitting all the way in the back there, who is working on this. They are looking at ways in which the AfCFTA can be greened, not necessarily by changing the provisions as they are, but finding ways in which African countries can proactively implement what is there and align it with their green objectives. So there's a lot of potential for an agreement like the AfCFTA to go much beyond just the text and really finding ways to leverage it. But I'm going to discuss it in the next round, so I'm going to leave it here and give the rest of the panel a chance as well.
Thank you very much for that response. I think it puts us in a good place to move forward with the discussion. Very clearly, I think from your response, there seems to be an increased acknowledgement of the need to integrate environmental aspects into the AfCFTA. The how of doing this, I think, is what perhaps needs to be discussed later. But what I wanted to highlight, and perhaps not just have an answer just now, is that it would be interesting, having dwelt very deep into those conversations or the articles and really trying to interpret them, why it has been the case that whilst there's that recognition, we don't seem to be moving in a direction where we have the implementation going. And perhaps it ties in very well to the next question that I wanted to pose to you, which is how can state parties strengthen the linkages between the AfCFTA and the environment and what strategies or mechanisms can be used to assist the countries?
Thank you very much for that question. There's, I think, a number of different ways in which this in which that link can be strengthened. And first is it's important to really look at well, to take a step back and to think, well, there's a lot of trade agreements out there, right? Lots of African countries, most of them are, not all, but many of them are a member of the WTO. They're already subject to lots of rules, and there's a lot of free trade agreements happening. There's regional economic communities going on. So where and what is the specific role the AfCFTA can play in strengthening the link between trade and the environment? And here, the AfCFTA has been applauded for its potential to, for example, create intra-African industrialization and value chains, right? So for instance, something is, I don't know, textiles, cotton is mostly being produced in West Africa. Then a lot of that cotton gets exported to Asia, where it is produced into textile, which is then re-imported into East Africa, where it then is turned into a t-shirt and subsequently goes either to mostly the US or Europe. So you see an extremely fragmented value chain. Now with the AfCFTA, the question is, can that value chain become an African and intra-African value chain by reducing tariffs, by reducing non-tariff barriers? So the question on how the provisions of the AfCFTA that seek to do exactly that, reducing those barriers to intra-African trade, to trade from the West to trade with the East, from ECOWAS to SADC and COMESA and EAC. How can these opportunities be identified? And those need to be specific value chains and opportunities for the environment. So this can be either products that are created in the continent and that could be beneficial, for example, for adaptation in other parts of the African continent, but it can also be much more integrated production and value chains. Raw materials that are extracted in one country could potentially be produced in another and used for the renewable transition. So what's required there is really strategic thinking about what African countries are making, what they can be making, and how that links to what is necessary for the environmental transition, both mitigation as well as adaptation. So that is one element that needs to be considered. And linked to that would be creating associated market access offerings. I know that at this point, the tariff schedules have not been finalized yet. The countries are still negotiating what part of their goods will be immediately liberalized in terms of tariffs, what parts will be excluded, and what part will be sensitive and gets a little bit longer for liberalization. But aligning those remaining parts of the tariff negotiations to these relevant elements of environmental products, parts of products, etc., would be really one part. Related, of course, is services. Services is indispensable. Finding ways in which intra-African services trade can be enhanced. And through doing all of this, also the importance of creating economies of scale. If you take, for example, the issue of plastic waste that's been discussed in other panels, a lot of African countries have the problem of receiving a lot of waste and also producing a lot of waste. In order to create that into less of an environmental problem and at the same time an industrial opportunity, one needs to create economies of scale. Not every African country can create a waste management plant. It's too expensive. You have to come together. So the AfCFTA, by reducing barriers of trade in certain products, can create those scalable opportunities and thereby enhance the response, in this case, to pollution. So that's number one. Another really important consideration that's being proposed is there scope for negotiating and adding a trade and environmental protocol? There is an allowance to make amendments to what we see in the AfCFTA. There has been appetite for change. There has been a third round added with a protocol on e-commerce, protocol on trade and gender. So why not adding a protocol on trade and the environment? That is one question. And I would also enjoy the discussion on that. Third point is implementation. A lot of there are actually already a lot of frameworks available within the African continent, not just in the AfCFTA context, but also the African Union agenda and others. And a lot of the issues are not perhaps so much in having another framework in place, but in the implementation of it. So there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done on implementing what's already there, and on implementing also what's in the AfCFTA and doing so strategically. Those are some considerations to take into account. And here, just before I end, if I may, just a final point, I think just to emphasize also the importance of countries, national strategic measures. So this is a regional agreement, but in order for that to actually be aligned with countries' nationally determined contributions or other environmental challenges and opportunities, countries need to be proactive about understanding where those opportunities are, where trade can come in, and then create those plans. And this is, again, an area where UNECA is doing some work. So I'm going to leave that here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And very concretely, making some suggestions that I think we should further discuss once we have heard from the others. But perhaps just one quick question I wanted us to, again, put aside and maybe come back to it. I think one of the suggestions you're making is making sure that, well, the possibility of having a separate trade and environment protocol being negotiated. The question I would want to pose there is, does this take away from the consolidation of the current efforts if they start focusing? Perhaps this is something that we can exchange about a little bit later. But I think you've made very good points that take us neatly to the second part of this. I think you're seeing it from the work that you have done, the research that has been done also by others. More practically, what are the businesses doing? And here I wanted to address myself to Peter, who can at least give us very concrete examples of what it is that they're doing. But the specific question I wanted to ask is, how can the AfCFTA promote sustainable consumption and uptake of green production methods by SMEs? Because I think unless we are in a better position to understand the key elements, only then can we be in a position to actually see what can be done in terms of providing support. So over to you, Peter, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Bonsoir. When it comes to things from the private sector angle, we always look at where the solutions are and where the opportunities are. One thing which is pretty straightforward, obviously, is, most businesses will look for where incentives are, and also look at where penalties are. And the idea is, the stick and carrot approach, looking for the carrots of the incentives, but then figuring out how to update, systems to tiptoe around the challenges of penalties. But what we've realized is the opportunity is actually massive. We've had our colleague Colette talk about waste management, for example. And that's something I'd like to look at, and I'll give a very simple example. We know much about the African continent. There's over 50 countries there. We know that there's a lot of agriculture ongoing, and there's probably a significant amount of waste that's existing around the agricultural sector. If you look at all the cotton that's going out, as part of the textile, and you look at the chocolate, cocoa, and you look at coffee, you look at tea, you look at cereals, grains, and you look at the global supply chains around those raw materials and the commodities that are linked to them. You'll find that easily. You can estimate that there's over 50 million tons of agricultural waste every year generated by each African country. So over 2.5 billion tons of agricultural waste generated each year. If you think of the value of that in terms of additional value that could be unlocked, that's, I come from the electricity and aerospace space, but on the electricity side, that's over 250 gigawatts of electricity generation capacity, which is quite significant. It has a dollar value of over $250 billion a year worth of electricity, which is much needed by the continent. And so, there you're looking at that waste as a value that can be unlocked. But based on the technologies which are now available, there's more that can come out of that. When you generate electricity from waste, you have other waste that come out of that. You've got things like green hydrogen, which has a value. You've got things like biofertilizers, which have a value. You have things like sustainable aviation fuel, which has a value as well. And you look at even green coal substitutes. So there, within the waste management and waste upcycling cycle, there are opportunities to value that waste in its raw form. So, the farmers who get the crops out there are able to increase their incomes. I look at easily, 50 billion to 100 billion a year in revenues to farmers directly, smallholders, which probably, is quite significant, doubles the kind of money spent by the aid ecosystem in those countries. But once you now look at the value of the electricity, and you look at the value of, the additional upcyclable waste products, which can help in, in delivering a more sustainable management of resources that don't need to be extracted anymore. And then you add the additional factor of the carbon industry, with carbon removals a massive part of the opportunity. You see that all this waste probably has $1 trillion a year value, and for all the economies. And when you think of what tax revenues can come out of that, when you think of what can go to, to the end producer and the value that can come out of that, and you look at the number of countries, available within the continent, at the end of the day, an extra over 20 billion a year for each of these countries, no matter whether you're talking about a South Africa or a Nigeria or a Uganda or Niger, it makes a massive difference. And so that's the way we basically look at it from the private sector. What could be done to highlight these opportunities? What could be done to look at the opportunities available to plug into the existing policies that exist within, the countries and the regions? That can help businesses realize that just by making a few tweaks in how they develop projects, in how they, understand the definition of tradable goods and services, there's a massive opportunity for the private sector to come on board and help unlock all of that latent value, which we see there. For ourselves as a company, we're a small company. We're just over 10 years old. So, of course, we are not making, trillions of dollars in revenues, but we have created small pilots where we do work in Uganda, which have helped us realize that these values are possible. We've worked closely with the government of Uganda, work closely with other private entities, global and local, Fortune 500, but also, the development and humanitarian ecosystem. And we see that the opportunities are there. And we've been invited to replicate in other countries such as South Africa, Botswana, Guinea, Nigeria, and others. And we see that there's a lot of learnings that can be shared and that we'd love to share further, which realizes all of these opportunities. Coming just back from the African Climate Summit last week, the carbon side is massive already, and there's so much business happening within the African continent on the carbon side, carbon removal especially, which is happening right beneath the noses of most of the tax authorities within Africa. I'm in business, but I'd like to talk about the elephant that tiptoes around the room. If you're talking about $1 billion already being traded in many of these countries, not being taxed, there's definitely room to think about, potentially adding these new trade and environmental protocols to the AfCFTA, because if that can lead to ministries of finance linking up with agriculture and environments and getting that additional knowledge in to understand these novel new commodities and novel new services which are being traded, it would make a difference to diversify the tax base, make a difference to, diversify how economies are flourishing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you've touched on excellent points in responding from a private sector perspective, where you're very clearly saying, look, when the opportunity is there, we don't wait perhaps for the policies to be put in place, even though we really would want the policies to be in place, which is what we have seen. But that in many ways is a situation that does not optimize what could potentially be the opportunity that is created by the AfCFTA. In some ways, I think you have also touched on what I was going to ask, which was how can SMEs leverage the AfCFTA opportunities in relation to the development of sustainable green and regional value chains. I think Colette spoke to us having a very strategic approach in terms of not only developing the strategies, but also in relation to how we tackle the implementation. So from your perspective, how do you think SMEs can leverage these opportunities?
SMEs have to be grateful that they can be nimble, and be grateful that being nimble means there's an opportunity to pilot or to basically try out, what would be considered pilots, by governments and, Fortune 500 companies, but which for an SME is not a pilot, it's probably something massive. But the opportunity there is to leapfrog, to pilot, and to prove the case for what may not yet be, solidly expressed in the agreements, the African CFTA, for example. If I take one case in point, if I look at, there's a massive thing which you hear around Africa, which goes, African countries should be allowed to, explore additional extractive industries, to kind of balance the boat. But that's based on an assumption that there is no money in the green transition. There's an assumption that the green transition is expensive. But SMEs can actually prove that it's not the case. SMEs can prove that the transition of brown to green is economically viable, brings in a lot of business, and it helps diversify the tax base. By the time you realize that, strategically speaking, looking ahead 50 years, you look at, kind of peak oil and so on and so forth, and you look at the move towards sustainable aviation fuels and the fact that it's all derived from what I talked about earlier: agricultural waste, nature-based solutions, invasive species, water, all that is so plentiful within the continent. It, for governments to start investing in that, they've got to see activity in the countries. They've got to realize that, all right, SME got on board, bigger company got on board, maybe global entity got on board, the partnerships happening. Then it's much easier for the government to study what's just been done and try to replicate it in changing how things are done. So SMEs have an opportunity to actually help speed up what needs to be done by implementing those case studies, which would have been a lot more expensive to be done at a top-down level. And if SMEs can prove that a country just developing oil and gas resources could earn more from using its existing waste potential or waste resources to generate sustainable aviation fuels that would earn even more money from even more bankable opportunities, and it tries it out and makes those trades and pays those taxes, you would find countries probably, speeding things up a lot faster. So I see the role of SMEs as catalytic and as enabling, multinationals, enabling, global public sector entities, but more importantly, enabling governments to bring down the cost of piloting, proving the case for and implementing policies which we know are very much needed to move us forward.
Thank you. I move to you, Jaya. UNEP has been doing a lot of good work on interesting studies in terms of trying to come up with some or provide some additional understanding in this particular area. And I wanted to zero in on a particular study, which you did on trade policy solutions for sustainable world meat consumption. Could you just tell us a bit more about the study and its findings?
Sure. Thank you, Dorothy. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. I just want to take a moment to thank ITC for having me and for the opportunity to talk about this very interesting study that UNEP just concluded. Before I go into the study itself, I want to talk just a little bit about the topic of sustainable consumption and trade in wild meat, because this is not something that is very commonly talked about in trade-related discussions or conversations. So beginning with that, over 2,000 species of mammals, birds, and reptiles are consumed as wild meat or bush meat, as it can be locally called globally. It is an important source of protein, fat, and micronutrients for millions of people around the world. And trade in wild meat is prevalent in across tropics in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And just in the Congo Basin alone, around 4.5 million tons of wild meat is extracted annually. And I say Congo Basin because that's the area on which this study focuses on. And besides being a source of nutrition for many communities, wild meat also plays a very crucial role in developing traditional knowledge. It represents an important source of income and livelihood. And it is a very important part of the culture of many indigenous peoples and local communities. The new study that UNEP has completed as part of the Trade Development and Environment Hub project, or the Trade Hub project as we call it, explores the role of trade policy in transitioning to a more sustainable level of consumption and trade of wild meat in the Congo Basin countries. Now, what is the issue that prompted the study? There is a growing appetite for wild-sourced meat in developing countries. And in this study, we focus on the Congo Basin countries. And this is a result of the growing population in urban areas and the resulting demand for wild-sourced meat arising from urban areas. And I think it's very important to note here that often it's the rural consumption that is pinpointed at, but subsistence level rural consumption and trade is often not the problem, but it is the urban consumption which drives the unregulated hunting and trade, which is causing the depletion of many large-bodied mammals in the areas of concern. And given the importance that wild meat has to culture, nutrition, and most importantly, the natural forest ecosystems, the consumption and trade need to be kept under sustainable levels. And many solutions have already been tried and tested for this. For example, alternative sources of protein and substitute meats have been proposed. Behavior change campaigns addressing the urban consumers have been proposed. Increased enforcement of wildlife laws and related trade has been proposed. But in the Congo Basin, none of this alone has worked in an isolated manner. So one of the lessons learned from the work in the region was that there needs to be a more systematic approach where all of these different solutions are combined. And learning from this, what the UNEP study does is it takes a systematic approach, a systems approach actually, which looks at the wild meat depletion issue as not just a conservation issue, as not just something for conservation biologists, but something from a more sustainable food systems angle. Because the study finds that the key factors that drive this overconsumption and trade is not necessarily only the lack of enforcement of conservation laws or forest governance laws, but more so the alternative income generation opportunities in the regions, access to alternative foods, rules governing extractive industries like the logging and mining industries in the region, among other things. So where does trade policy come in? Trade policy can be used as a tool to limit the unsustainable consumption and trade of wild meat, largely by one, preventing the movement of unsustainably caught wild meat, helping to increase the availability of sustainably sourced meats and substitute meats as alternatives, and most importantly, creating an enabling environment that reduces the dependency of the rural population on hunting and commercial trade of wild meat. And this can be through enhanced food supply at affordable prices, job creation, support to infant industries, and so on. So the study puts forward few key recommendations. One of them being improving the supply of legally and sustainably sourced wild meat with the development of trade-related standards, frameworks, and increased capacity to facilitate legal, transparent, and traceable trade of wild meat in the region. Smoother and improved trade facilitation, provisions in trade agreements regulating the environmental and social implications of extractive industries, especially the logging and mining industries that give access to forests where this trade is most prevalent, and trade policy safeguards to support the growth of nationally relevant and sensitive job-creating industries in the region. So I will stop here, and we can go into more detail in the next section.
Very briefly, could you tell us what would be what role the AfCFTA could play in this regard? Very briefly.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'll be very quick. So the brief, which I encourage you to read, outlines many solutions, but I will list maybe one or two examples. Let's take the example of improving the supply of legally and sustainably sourced wild meat. One of the challenges faced for the value chain actors is that there is no common definition of what is wild meat. And because of the various ways in which it's produced and harvested, one of the measures that can be done under the AfCFTA at the AfCFTA level can be defining what is considered wildlife meat for the purposes of commercial trade. And this standard can clarify the production and harvesting practices that can be taken into account. And the next step to this would be then having more granularity in the HS codes beyond the 6 digits. And this will help not only trace the meat and the trade and understand the economic value, but also, like Peter said, introduce the incentives that will be needed to increase compliance with sustainability regulations. A last point I would make is the smoother facilitation of import and export procedures. There is a non-tariff barrier, online reporting, monitoring, and eliminating mechanism, but the assumption under the AfCFTA, but the assumption is that the actors concerned first know about it, and second, that they identify their challenges as non-tariff barriers to report it, and third, that there is enough confidence that they would put in a complaint and expect it to be addressed. So developing training and to guide the different value chain actors about the existing mechanisms and enhancing capacity, administrative capacity at large would be another suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I move very quickly to His Excellency Professor Muhammadu Ka. I took the liberty to introduce you in your absence, and we're very delighted to have you. And I'll move quickly to you in view of the time that we have left with us. I think we've tackled the issues from different perspectives, from the studies done, from the research, or indeed the experience from a very professional and advisory perspective, but more so also from the private sector side. But I think it's equally important that we address ourselves from the country perspective, but from what is happening at the Geneva level. And here, Excellency, I wanted to pose the question as to how can cooperation amongst member states support environmentally friendly production, trade, and consumption? You having served in various capacities, including that of leading the African group here in Geneva, how would you see this?
Thank you so much, Dorothy. First of all, I want to take the opportunity to thank you and the ITC family for the brilliant work you continue to do on behalf of member states, particularly member states in developing countries, Africa, and small states. But the Gambia is very, very grateful for the impactful work that continue to impact many, many lives, especially lives of the youth and women and SMEs and MSMEs. From my lenses, African member states must meaningfully cooperate and partner. That's the bottom line of it. It is critical and quite fundamental to strengthen the ethos of AfCFTA, and will undoubtedly facilitate accelerating a very friendly production, efficient trade and consumption that will create impactful and sustainable value. It is worth underscoring that the level of intra-African trade is quite low, standing at a paltry 15% of Africa's total trade volume. This is significantly lower than interregional trade in other continents. The FAO estimated that there has been 22% increase in malnutrition in Africa from 2019 to 2021. This is likely to be further exacerbated by the current global food price inflation, high cost of agricultural inputs, and extreme climate events, and most of our member states are receiving the tough end of it. In principle, the AfCFTA is expected to significantly boost regional trade once tariffs fall, and likely to double if non-tariff barriers are successfully addressed. So African member states aim to reduce tariffs by an estimate of 90% over a period of 5 years for developing African countries and 10 years for LDCs. Therefore, the AfCFTA has the potential to transform intra-African trade and improve the livelihoods of smallholder farmers and reduce poverty in the continent. So the World Bank estimates that it could lift 30 million people from extreme poverty. So in relation to agriculture, it can leverage on the various forward-looking continental initiatives on green transformation, production, and sustainable consumption in Africa, which includes the Feed African program, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, the Food Trade Coalition for Africa. And these are all collaborations and partnerships among member states. So a more vibrant regional market in food items under the AfCFTA will go a very long way in addressing some of these challenges of food insecurity. Topographic and climate difference across the continent means that there is great potential for more intra-African trade in food crops. For example, in 2016 to 2017, Ugandan food exports to Kenya contributed in cushioning the effects of the droughts in Kenya. Stronger regional energy markets can also play a crucial role in reducing carbon emissions on the continent. Africa undoubtedly is rich in renewable energy sources such as geothermal, wind power, and hydroelectric. A great reliance on intra and interregional power pools, such as the West Africa Power Pool and the Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya interconnector for the Eastern Africa and Southern Africa power pools, can reduce the dependence on traditional fossil fuel. So you can see how the power of collaboration and partnership that are meaningful among member states will reinvigorate and strengthen the ethos that AfCFTA is progressing to do for the continent. I must say that technological changes for example, the fourth industrial revolution and beyond. We've actually leaped from the fourth industrial revolution to the fifth in some circles, people are saying, can facilitate smaller scale production in smart manufacturing, making a localized approach to production much more viable, much more agile, and in the face of the significant disruptions to global trade in recent years, which inevitably will shorten supply chains and producing more for regional markets, which is an attractive proposition. So therefore, I would say, Dorothy, that the AfCFTA encourages businesses to cater more to local tastes and demands. So accordingly, this greater intra-regional trade will be less damaging to the global environment and long-distance value chains. And supply chains, efficient supply chains that are e-supply chains, that harness the power of digital transformation, will be key in the collaborations and partnerships to reinvigorate trade and scaling up quality production and sustainable consumptions, which means that as we think of this collaboration and partnership and the role of digital as a catalyst, it means that we have to reflect on mechanisms to partner and collaborate with the right institutions such as the ITU and WTO and ITC in their efforts to make sure that access to ubiquitous and secure, as well as affordable broadband connectivity with data and digital infrastructure is essential in resetting and resituating a meaningful collaboration and partnership moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Excellency. Very quickly to the next question, which I think brings us back again to the Geneva context. And this one relates to Gambia being one of those 4 African countries or members of the WTO that are very actively participating in the trade and environmental sustainability joint statement initiative. Could you please tell us why the Gambia finds it important to be part of this initiative?
Well, we are a very small country, but we don't take our small size as a hindrance to reinvigorate and strengthen our efforts, especially as it relates to climate. I will just share a brief overview of the climate change context in the Gambia. Since the 1950s, minimum temperatures across the Gambia increased steadily at the rate of 0.4 to 0.67 degrees per decade. According to our third national communication, the Gambia is expected to be hotter and drier by 2100. The Gambia has realized about 35% decrease in its average annual rainfall in the past 5 decades. Importantly, the crop growing wet season rainfall is predicted to decrease, coupled with an increase in the occurrence of heavy rainfall events and floods. And we are currently experiencing these as I speak to you here today. It is estimated that a 1 metric rise in sea level would inundate 60% of mangrove forests, 33% of swampy areas, and 20% of rice growing areas, assuming protective measurements are taken. So the adverse impacts of these changes on agriculture, on forestry, on fisheries, and tourism are amplified and accelerated by saline intrusions into arable land with attendant losses in productivity of land resources, water, nutrient, and sedimentary fluxes. So the above projections that I have just shared are a real threat to agriculture, to food security, and trade in my country, the Gambia. thus illustrating the dangers of climate change on our livelihoods across our country. Accordingly, in 2021, the government of the Gambia, as part of its ratification of the Paris Agreement, committed to consolidate its fight against climate change by integrating the identified mitigation measures into national planning processes. Accordingly, we formulated a green recovery focused national development plan 2023 to 2028. As a result of these efforts, the Gambia has now been recognized as one of the world's climate resilience leaders for its ambitious and decisive strategy for tackling the impacts of these rising sea levels, the temperatures that I shared, and the degradation of soil. So these national endeavors necessitate collective solutions and multilateral cooperations and partnerships, as I mentioned in the earlier question that you've asked, and hence the Gambia's commitment to the WTO Trade and Environmental Sustainability Joint Statement Initiatives, the JSI. In this vein, the Gambia is one of only 3 least developing countries that is participating in current WTO trade and environment sustainability structured discussions. So we take this very, very seriously because we are a small coastal state that is hugely affected, and we have to act, and we act through collaborations and partnerships. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Excellency. Very clear there in terms of giving us a sense as to why it's important to ensure that the multilateral system is still one that is effective, one that we need to be participating in to make sure that we have the predictability and transparency to what is agreed concretely. We have very, very few minutes, and I just wanted to open the floor for 1 or 2 questions before we close. I will just come back to each of the panelists for a minute final comment. Yes, please. If you could just introduce yourself and ask the question.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Bimisola Ajayi. I'm a digital transformation consultant from the UK. And thank you very much, panel. Very nice discussion there. And from my perspective, I've actually learned a lot. I didn't know who AfCFTA was, but now I know who you are and what you do and how you're quite an important body for fostering the multilateral discussions and across the continent. Professor, you mentioned that you're one of 3 countries that are currently facilitating this discussions and in participation with the WTO, in partnership rather with WTO. Who are the other 2 countries, please? Which countries are they?
Okay, thank you very much. We take that. A final question from the floor. Is everybody too tired, or they now understand all the abbreviations we've been using? Back to you, Excellency, and then I'll give the opportunity to the other.
I don't have that on top of my head. Maybe, David, do you remember those 2 countries? We'll get back to you on that.
Okay, the reason I ask is because the statistics you gave us is quite interesting.
Yes.
I mean, because you've projected to understand what the temperatures or the climate could be like in 2100, that is very interesting. So everybody else should be thinking about the future. They should be, projecting about environmental changes and how they can kind of intervene now. So it would be nice to know who are the other people that are doing stuff and how is the data collected. There's been a lot of talk this week about transferring technology. So if there are best practices, then maybe that needs to be shared across, and maybe there should be like a central place for collating some of this data that's been talked about. They're talking about data is available, but it's not always known where they are or who needs what, and there's security issues or data sharing and trust issues among countries. So some sort of best practice might be useful, and maybe like a central repository for the kind of data you shared today that could be useful across the board. That's just my thoughts, please.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, if I could just get back to my panel. Peter, I'll start with you. Any final word, having listened to everyone's contribution and what has come from the floor? 1 minute, please.
Absolutely. Much gratitude to His Excellency for listing much gratitude to His Excellency for listing a few interesting opportunities, and I'm going to look at those opportunities from the private sector angle. If I look at the, increase in temperatures, and, and I look at so there's probably a lot of sunshine, so that's solar. If I look at the decrease in average rainfall, I look at the coastal, side of things, and look at desalination as an opportunity. When I look at, and that's linked to solar, when I look at the heavy rainfall and floods, I look at the opportunity to build, reservoirs, and I see concrete and, kind of the opportunity to link to the rice he mentioned, because rice husks are over 30%, the fly ash from it is more than 30% silica, which is used in concrete making. And, it's green concrete. That's another opportunity. And then I look at the loss in reduction, the reduction in soil quality and, and so on. And I see the same biochar and biofertilizers can go in there. And if the sea levels rise and we can't grow rice by the sea anymore, we can go for upland rice with the biochar and biofertilizer and, desalination. And there are interesting ways to take all of those challenges as a catalyst to realize the opportunities of, replicating mature, though novel technologies in the Gambia, and hopefully showcase the opportunity to actually take these challenges, fix them in one part of the Gambia, and then have the rest of your colleagues, the other 3 countries, learn from it, and everyone else learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you. Colette, 1 minute.
Thank you. For me, what's coming out of this panel is the importance of connecting the different elements of the discussion on trade and Africa and the AfCFTA. I'm a lawyer, so I approach it from a provisions perspective as a starting point. What is in the AfCFTA? What is not there? How can we improve this? But we've heard from the private sector, there the starting point is very different. It's where are the opportunities for business. We've heard from Jaya talking about a very specific environmental problem and the value chain around it and the opportunities around it. Just like there's the wild meat, there's so many others. We've heard from the ambassador about a number of different elements from energy generation. We've heard about pollution. We've heard about biodiversity. So there's so many different angles. We've heard about the urgency of addressing this from a country perspective. And I think in order for trade to be better connected to the environmental opportunities and challenges, we need to bring that conversation better together. So the business people understand the legal side, understand the national challenges, the value chain specific issues, and vice versa. And we can then together decide or better see where we really have to focus to strengthen this link. So that's a takeaway for me from this panel. And indeed, the Gambia, very interesting to hear the very proactive approach to being involved in greening trade.
Thank you, Jaya, about that meat, which I love to eat when it's legally obtained. Please, your final comments, 1 minute.
Thank you, Dorothy. Well, I just want to say that from this panel, my takeaway is that there is much value in international environmental cooperation globally, but also at the continental level. And this should go hand in hand with trade cooperation. From UNEP, we stand ready to support members in their efforts with the scientific data and knowledge we produce. And I also want to take a moment to thank all my fellow panelists for their very insightful comments. And I would stop there. Thank you.
Excellency, back to you. 1 minute.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you for that very valuable question. And I think your question around digital and data is very, very critical in the nexus of environment, sustainability, trade, and climate. We cannot address them if we do not have an evidence-based approach to understand and demystify the existing data across these member states. So making sure that we have data infrastructure and digital transformation in our member states around the nexus of environment, sustainability, trade, and climate, and how it will reinvigorate intra-trade and inter-regional trade, as well as making sure that we have efficient supply chain to drive production and scale production efficiently, sustainably to effect and influence consumption in the long run. The question that you asked, I think the three countries are Chad, Senegal, and possibly Cape Verde. And you know, I'll be happy, we'll exchange cards to confirm that. But these are the three countries that are involved in the WTO discussions around sustainability and environment and the climate. And we must constructively come around the table and engage. The more member states take this as a reality. Our countries are currently being affected by floods. I mean, what is happening in the world, Africa and member states are not going to be insulated, and it is related to climate. Climate crisis is a reality. Greening, we must. We cannot do it as individual countries. We have to collaborate. We have to partner. We have to make sure that we get it right with the AfCFTA mechanisms. The centrality of multilateralism is our only hope. So multilateralism must work, and we must ensure that we get the engagements and the support and the collaboration within the multilateral ecosystem. So the work of WTO, the work of ITC, the work of the AfCFTA is quite critical. The role of civil society in our countries and the role of the private sector and the youth folk are also essential in meaningful collaborations and partnerships. Nobody is going to do it for us. We have to do it ourselves, and we have to ensure that we have these partnerships that are sustainable, that are impactful, that reaches those that are affected most, who are in the periphery, in the rural communities. Those that work with production and environment are not people in the urban areas. It is the women and the youths in our rural communities. So we have to invest in reconfiguring and re-architecturing these areas that are affected by the consequences. And I will stop there. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I'm hoping that next year, you can come back and tell us what's been done in 1 year, and there would be progress and more countries that come on board, you know, because that's what I would like to hear. This conference has been yada, 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 yada. I haven't seen anyone tell me what's improved since the last conference across the board. It's just been, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I will say that there is a lot that is happening across the continent. There is a lot that is happening in the continent. The fact that you said that you didn't know about the AfCFTA, that tells you that there is something happening across the continent, because
Let me just hear about
Could I just
I
ask
just
that
don't
we-
want you to
we
go
allow
away.
a dialogue outside so that we can perhaps respond to some of your concerns, but I do agree with His Excellency.
Yeah, I
that
just
there's
want
a
him,
lot.
I just want her to go away, knowing that you said you have learned something, which is that the AfCFTA is happening. That means that from last year and the year before, there is mechanisms that are ongoing. I just shared with you the example of the Gambia, right? So there are things that are happening. I think it is those of us who are not in the continent to step up our efforts to be on the ground as well and engage with the many competent and highly capable and committed actors and agents that are partnering with multilateral mechanisms like the ITC, among others, who are impacting and uplifting many lives in each of these member states. So there are things happening.
Absolutely. I think I will not even try to summarize. I think Excellency saw what I had written on my paper. But suffice to just add that at the core of everything that we are talking about, private sector, in particular micro, small and medium enterprises, will have to be at the center of what we are doing to make sure that that trade does happen. And here, I think we heard from Peter that for private sector, if the opportunity is created, they are ready to move. But we also acknowledge that we have to do this in an inclusive way. And therefore, we have to think about those that are not normally reached out to and try to find solutions that could be adapted and workable in their type of a situation. The capacity building aspect, I just want to emphasize on that. Coming to your point, the provisions are there. Some action is ongoing. From the last time we had met to today, trade is actually happening in some of the countries, but it's not all of them. It's because they don't know perhaps how to move forward in terms of taking advantages of the opportunities, aside from not knowing at all. And this is where I absolutely agree with His Excellency that we need to make sure that we are working in a collaborative way and ensuring that we are taking advantage of the strategic partnerships to leverage all the resources and make sure that we optimize the results. I think one aspect we haven't spoken to a lot is access to finance. I know out of Nairobi, there was a lot of discussion around financing. I think it's important that we try to find the money. The pledges might be there. First and foremost, the pledges have to come through, but secondly, that we have mechanisms that are workable. A lot of what we have heard from the ITC perspective is the funding is there, but we can't access it because the conditions attached to it are ones that are not easily met. So trying to find ways of doing all this. But in all this, I think I want to stress the nimbleness makes it possible for our businesses to respond, those that can immediately do so and those that we have to support. So the final word, implementation, and if we can focus on how we can support countries to actually move forward with the implementation, that is the direction we should be taking it. I want to thank a very active and engaged panel that we have had. So thank you very much for being here. And thank you to all of you for your patience. And I know I could see a lot of you nodding, showing that you were really following the conversations. So thank you very much for being here.